So far these things have been made manifest unto thee. Thrice greatest one. Reflect on all the rest in the same way within thyself, and thou shalt not be led astray. That line closes the 11th book of the Corpus Hermeticum, a divine mind addressing a student, calling him thrice greatest, Trismegistus. It's the origin of the name this entire tradition is built upon, and it raises the obvious question, who is being called that and why? In 1488, workers laying a marble floor in Siena Cathedral included something unusual for a Catholic church: a robed sage standing shoulder to shoulder with Moses. The inscription beneath it reads Hermes Trismegistus, contemporary of Moses. The church, in the heart of Renaissance Italy, believed these men have lived before Christianity, before Judaism as we understand it, and had somehow already grasped the nature of God. But here's the problem. Historians still do not agree on who or what Hermes Trismegistus actually was: an Egyptian god, a Greek philosopher, a composite of authors who never met, writing centuries apart under one shared name. So which is it? And why did some of history's sharpest minds, Renaissance popes, court philosophers, and later Isaac Newton himself, believe the figure held the oldest wisdom on earth? Let's find out. Part 1. The Egyptian Roots. To understand Hermes Trismegistus, we have to go back nearly 3,000 years before the cathedral floor was ever laid to the Nile. In ancient Egyptian religion, Thoth was the god of writing, wisdom, magic, and the measurement of time. He was said to have invented hieroglyphic writing itself, and he served as a scribe to the gods, recording the judgment of souls in the afterlife. Thoth wasn't a minor figure in the Egyptian pantheon. He was the keeper of divine wisdom, the mediator between the human and the sacred. Depictions of Thoth typically showed him as a man with the head of an ibis, or sometimes as a baboon, holding a scribe's palette. His major cult center was Kumun, a city the Greeks will later rename Hierapolis, the city of Hermes. That renaming is the first thread connecting Thoth to the figure we're discussing today. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 before Christ, and the Ptolemaic dynasty took over afterwards, something significantly happened culturally. Greek and Egyptian religious traditions began to merge. This process is called syncretism, when two cultures identify their gods with one another, treating them as different names for the same underlying deity. The Greeks had their own god of writing, communication, and boundary crossing. Hermes, messenger of the gods, guided the souls to the underworld, patron of merchants and thieves alike. The Greek settlers living in Egypt thought to look remarkably like their own Hermes. Both gods of writing, both mediators between worlds, both associated with hidden knowledge. So the two merged. Thoth became Hermes in Greek-speaking Egypt, and over the following centuries this merged deity picked up an additional title, Trismegistus, meaning the thrice great or the thrice greatest. The exact origin of this epithet is debated. Some scholars trace it to older Egyptian titles praising Thoth as great, great, great. Others to a specific triad of attributes he was said to master. This is worth pausing on because it's the first example of something we'll see again and again in this story. Hermes Trismegistus was never one clean, singular figure. From the very beginning, he was a fusion, Egyptian and Greek, divine and philosophical, myth and scholarship layered on top of each other by different cultures for different reasons. By the time we reach the early century CE, in the multicultural, intellectually restless city of Alexandria, Hermes Trismegistus had shifted again from a god of people worship to a legendary sage people wrote in the voice of. And that shift is where the texts that made him famous actually come from. Part 2. The text attributed to him. Here is where I want to be very precise. This is the point where a lot of popular content about Hermetism starts making claims the sources don't actually support. The body of writing attributed to Hermes Trismegistus is called the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Greek philosophical and religious texts, along with a separate related text called the Emerald Tablet, and a longer dialogue called the Asclepius. Together, these form what scholars now call the Hermetica. The Corpus Hermeticum consists of 17 treatises, most written in the form of dialogues, a teacher, presented as Hermes, instructing a student, often named Asclepius or Thoth, on questions of cosmology, the nature of God, the fate of the souls, and the structure of the universe. Here is the critical fact. Modern scholarship dates these texts to roughly the 2nd or 3rd century CE, meaning they were written in the Roman era Egypt, not in some remote antiquity before Moses and the Renaissance believed. They were composed in Greek, drawing on a blend of Platonic philosophy, Stoic cosmology, Jewish wisdom literature, and older Egyptian religious concepts, all filtered to the intellectual culture of Hellenistic Alexandria. And critically, they were not written by one person. Linguistic analysis shows different treatises have different authorial voices, different levels of philosophical sophistication, and even some internal inconsistent ideas about the nature of God and creation. This tells us we're looking at a body of work produced by multiple authors over an extended period, all writing under the shared authority of Hermes. A common practice in the ancient world, where attributing a text to a legendary wise figure lent it credibility. This is not unique to Hermetism, by the way. Similar things happen with texts attributed to Solomon, to Orpheus, to Zoroaster. Pseudonymous attributed authorship was a normal literary convention, not a deception in the modern sense, but a way of signaling this text belongs to the tradition of this wisdom. So, what do these texts actually say? The most famous, the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, is called the Poimandres, meaning roughly shepherd of men. In it, Hermes receives a vision from a divine being who explains the creation of the cosmos, a primordial light, a descent of a divine mind into matter, and the possibility of the human soul ascending back through the celestial spheres to reunite with the divine source it came from. This ascent narrative, that the soul descends into the material world and can rise back up again through layers of reality towards its origin, is the philosophical core of Hermetism. It shares clear DNA with Neoplatonism and with Platonism, particularly the idea in Plato's philosophy that the physical world is a lower reflection of higher, more real divine order. Then there's the Emerald Tablet, much shorter, more cryptic, is structured almost like an alchemical formula rather than a philosophical dialogue. It contains the phrase Hermetism is almost famous for today. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below. We'll do an entire episode unpacking this single line, because it's been badly misused and oversimplified in modern pop culture. But for now, that is its original context was cosmological and alchemical. describing correspondence between different layers of reality, not a vague mystical slogan. Unlike the Corpus Hermeticum, the emerald tablet doesn't actually appear in the historical record until much later. It shows up in Arabic alchemical text around the 8th or 9th century CE. Centuries after the Greek Hermetica, before eventually being translated into Latin and entering European alchemy in the Middle Ages. This is an important detail scholars use to distinguish the different layers of the Hermetic tradition. They didn't all emerge at once from one source but accumulated over roughly 1,000 years across different cultures. So to summarize this section clearly, what we call Hermetism is really a composite tradition, Greek philosophical dialogues from Roman Egypt, plus a separate alchemical text from the early Islamic world, all attributed after the fact to a legendary teacher who was himself a fusion of an Egyptian god and a Greek god. There was no single Hermes Trismegistus sitting down and writing this on one unified body of work. Knowing this doesn't make the text less interesting. If anything, it makes them more interesting because it means we're looking at a genuine, centuries-long conversation between multiple civilizations about the nature of reality, mind, and divinity, all channeled through one shared symbolical figure. Part 3. The Renaissance Revival. For most of the Middle Ages in Western Europe, the Corpus Hermeticum was essentially unknown. A few fragments circulated, mostly through the Latin Asclepius, but the full body of Hermetic philosophy was largely stayed within Byzantine and Aramic intellectual circles. That changed dramatically in 1460s in Florence, under one of history's most consequential patrons of scholarship, Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo had commissioned a scholar named Marsilio Ficino to translate the complete works of Plato into Latin, a massive undertaking that will help ignite the Renaissance revival of classical philosophy. But in 1460, a manuscript arrived in Florence containing Greek text of the Corpus Hermeticum, brought from Macedonia by a monk collecting manuscripts for Cosimo's library. According to the accounts we have, Cosimo was eager to read this text, that he ordered Ficino to set aside the Plato translation and translate the Hermetica first. Ficino completed this in 1463 and it was published under the title Pimander. Why the urgency? Because of a chronological belief that dominated Renaissance thinking about ancient wisdom, a belief scholars now call the Prisca Theologia, or ancient theology. Renaissance humanists believed that God had revealed a single unified truth to humanity in the distant past, which had been passed down and echoed in fragmented form through figures like Moses, Zoroaster, Orpheus, and Hermes Trismegistus. Crucially, based on the scholarship available at that time, Ficino and his contemporaries believe Hermes Trismegistus had lived in extremely deep antiquity, genuinely contemporary with or even before Moses. This is exactly what the Siena Cathedral floor from our cold open is depicting. Hermes as a pagan prophet who had somehow arrived at true monotheistic wisdom independently, validating Christian truth from an entirely separate ancient source. This belief transformed Hermes Trismegistus from an obscure figure into one of the most intellectually prestigious names in Renaissance Europe. If he predated Moses and had already understood the nature of the divine, then his writings weren't pagan superstition to be dismissed. They were an independent, ancient confirmation of Christian truth, and studying them was a legitimate, even pious act of scholarship. This is the context that allowed Hermetic philosophy to spread through Renaissance intellectual culture. influencing art, philosophy, and eventually the more controversial practice of Renaissance magic. And thinkers like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola combined Hermetic ideas with Jewish Kabbalah and Christian theology into an elaborate syncretism. It also fed directly into the alchemical tradition, because the emerald tablet was understood as part of the same Hermetic wisdom lineage. Alchemy took on a philosophical dimension beyond simple metallurgy, the transformation of base metal into gold, and became a symbol, for some practitioners, of the transformation of the human soul itself. This is the intellectual soil that later produced figures we associate with the birth of modern science. We'll cover this in detail in a future episode, but it's worth naming now. Isaac Newton spent an enormous amount of time studying alchemical and Hermetic texts alongside with mathematical and physical works. This wasn't a contradiction for him. In the intellectual world he inherited, alchemy, Hermetism, and what we now call physics weren't yet separated into distinct disciplines the way they are today. Part 4. What modern scholarship actually established. So how did this prestigious ancient pedigree collapse? In 1614, a Swiss philologist named Isaac Casaubon published a detailed linguistic analysis of the Corpus Hermeticum, using the tools of Renaissance textual scholarship, comparing vocabulary, grammar, and philosophical concepts against securely dated Greek text. Casaubon demonstrated that the Hermetica could not possibly predate Moses or even predate Christianity. The language, philosophical vocabulary, and conceptual framework matched Greek writing from the early centuries CE, not remote antiquity. This was a landmark moment in the history of textual criticism, arguably one of the founding moments of the discipline we'll now call philology, the scientific study of language and text to determine their authorship and dating. Casaubon's redating didn't destroy interest in Hermetism, but it fundamentally changed its status from an ancient prophecy to Roman-era philosophical synthesis. Modern scholarship has only really refined this picture since. Today, historians of religion and classics generally agree on a few key points. The Corpus Hermeticum was composed by multiple authors in Greek-speaking Egypt, likely across the 2nd or 3rd century CE. It draws heavily on Platonic and Stoic philosophy, blended with older Egyptian religious concepts and some Jewish influence, and it represents a genuine, sophisticated philosophical and religious tradition, not a hoax, not a forgery in the sense of intentional deception, but a pseudonymous body of work in a tradition where that took a normal place. None of this makes the Hermetica less worth studying. If anything, understanding the accurate historical context makes the ideas more interesting rather than less, because we can see clearly what problem these ancient authors were actually working on. They were writing during a period when Platonic philosophy, Egyptian religious wisdom, and early Christian and Jewish monotheism were all in close contact in Alexandria, and they were attempting a genuine synthesis of this worldview into a coherent account of God, the cosmos, and the soul. That's a remarkable intellectual achievement on its own terms. It doesn't need an inflated ancient pedigree to be significant. In closing, so who was Hermes Trismegistus? Not a single historical person, not literally an Egyptian god who wrote books. He was something more interesting than either of those. A composite figure. Thoth emerged with Hermes, a Hellenistic Egyptian invention, who became the attributed voice for a genuine, century-spanning philosophical tradition, later mistaken by Renaissance Europe for an ancient prophet, and finally correctly redated by the birth of modern textual scholarship. What survives across all of that historical revision is the actual philosophy, the ideas about the soul descending to matter and its potential ascent back towards the divine, the vision of correspondence between different levels of reality, and a genuinely ambitious attempt to unify the Egyptian, Greek, and monotheistic thought into one framework. In the next episode, we're going to slow down and go through the Emerald Tablet line by line, including the famous phrase, as above, so below, and what it actually means to the alchemist who used it, centuries before it became a New Age bumper sticker. If you want to actually understand esoteric philosophy, instead of just observing the version that gets flattened by social media, subscribe. This is only the beginning. Thank you.